Sodom and Gomorrah are two cities mentioned in the Bible, located near where the patriarch Abraham lived. Their story, told in the book of Genesis, has captivated generations for its lessons on morality and divine punishment. According to the biblical account, these cities were destroyed by direct punishment from God due to the magnitude of their sins. But what really happened? What kind of transgressions did the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah commit that led to their complete annihilation? Okay, dear listener, in this video we will answer all these questions. Join us on this fascinating journey through the Holy Scriptures, and let's discover together the true story of Sodom and Gomorrah. But before we delve into the subject, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell so that YouTube will notify you every time we publish a new video. A modern example that can help us better understand the magnitude of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is the 1970 Anash earthquake, known locally as the Earthquake of 70. This earthquake occurred on Sunday, May 31st, 1970 at 3:23 p.m. and reached a magnitude of 7.9 on the moment magnitude scale. The destruction was devastating, and the affected cities on the coast and mountains of Peru experienced tremendous human and material losses. In the same vein, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is described in the Bible as an apotheotic catastrophe in which the city was completely razed by fire and brimstone sent from heaven. Both events, although different in nature, show us the unstoppable power of a destructive force that comes as punishment for evil and sin. The magnitude of the destruction in Sodom and Gomorrah, according to the biblical account, can be compared to the sense of panic and chaos experienced by the inhabitants during events of great disaster, such as the Anash earthquake in 1970. In that earthquake, with a force of 7.9 on the magnitude scale, millions of people in Peru felt terror as the earth trembled, and its intensity increased with each passing second. People fled desperately, seeking refuge in open places, just as the inhabitants of Sodom, in their desperation, cried out for help. The Bible describes how the angels who'd been sent to warn Lot and his family told them to flee quickly, for God's punishment was already underway. The city was about to be irreparably destroyed, just as the survivors of the 1970 earthquake faced devastation at its finest. Finally, when the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was complete, the magnitude of divine punishment was so devastating that nothing could be left standing. Just as the Anash earthquake in 1970 left a series of tragedies in its wake, in Sodom and Gomorrah, the punishment was imminent. The city, prosperous and full of life, was devastated by fire and brimstone sent from heaven, just as the avalanche that descended from the snowy Huascaran and buried the city of Yungay. The biblical account describes how the city was consumed without mercy, and only the few survivors who were able to escape, like Lot and his family, were able to flee to a safe place. But the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was irreversible, like the cities buried by the avalanche of 1970, where nothing remained but ruins and memories of what once was. In the tragedy of Sodom, as in Yungay, the devastation was total, and survival was a miracle. In the case of Sodom and Gomorrah, the moral corruption was so deep that the city had become a symbol of sin and perversion. Like Yungay, which was known for its prosperity but also for idolatry and sin, the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were full of corruption. According to the testimony of many, the people of these cities boasted of their wealth and power, but their morality had declined to such an extent that sin was part of their daily life. Idolatry and violence were common practices, and justice seemed to be absent. In the sacred scriptures, we see how the perversion was so great that God decided to intervene, destroying both cities to put an end to their wickedness. Similarly, in some traditions, it is mentioned that the city of Yungay was marked by idolatry, and the tragedy that occurred there is interpreted as a kind of divine warning, although only God knows the true reason for its destruction. All this leads us to reflect on the possibility that the city of Yungai was the victim of a divine judgment, similar to that suffered by the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. The story of these two cities, which appears in the book of Genesis, is one of the best known and most controversial stories in the Bible. Although it is not known for certain who founded Sodom and Gomorrah, it is believed that they were established by the Canaanites or the Amorites, people who, according to the Bible, were known for their perversion and rejection of divine morality. The biblical account tells us that the destruction of both cities was the result of divine punishment due to the severity of their sins. This story has endured throughout the centuries and has been used as a warning about the consequences of sin and disobedience to God's law, as have the tragic events that occurred in Yungai, which some interpret as a lesson about morality and divine justice. The passage in Genesis presents God as an implacable judge, willing to punish the wickedness of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah with total destruction. It is from this story that the expression Sodomite arises, which originally referred to the gentilic of the inhabitants of Sodom. However, over time, the term sodomite has taken on a different meaning, especially in the modern context where it has been used to describe male homosexuals, although it is also used to refer to those who practice acts considered perverse or immoral, according to certain social and religious standards. The use of the term varies according to the ideological context and the interpretation of history, but in all cases it refers to the biblical narrative, which shows how the lack of morality and the transgression of divine laws led to the condemnation of these cities, whose inhabitants suffered divine punishment. Sodom and Gomorrah were part of the 5 cities that were located in the fertile Jordan Valley, a region known for its extraordinary beauty and abundance. The land was so fertile and attractive that it was compared to the Garden of Jehovah and the rich land of Egypt. This prosperity was perhaps what motivated Lot when he decided to separate from his uncle Abraham, to choose precisely the plain of the Jordan, where Sodom was located, the city he chose to live in. The appearance of the region was so tempting that Lot, like many others, could not resist its charms. However, what seemed to be a blessing on the material level would soon be revealed as a deadly trap. Let us read Genesis 13:10 onwards to better understand how Lot made this crucial decision. This passage from Genesis 13:10-13 describes the moment when Lot, upon looking up, was attracted by the fertile plain of the Jordan. It was a place so beautiful and productive that it seemed like an earthly paradise, comparable to the Garden of Jehovah and the rich land of Egypt. It was this appearance of abundance and well-being that led Lot to make the decision to separate from his uncle Abraham, choosing to live in the cities of the plain, starting with Sodom. However, as the last part of the passage tells us, the inhabitants of Sodom were known for their wickedness and extreme sin against God. Despite the beauty and prosperity of the land, the moral corruption that reigned in Sodom was so great that although Lot may have chosen a place that seemed promising, he was choosing to live in the midst of a city destined for destruction because of its wickedness. This contrast between the outward appearance and the true moral condition of the city is one of the most profound lessons of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Dear friends, Abraham was not expelling Lot from the promised land in the previous verses. He simply offered him the opportunity to choose, asking him to go north or south. Abraham gave Lot the freedom to choose what seemed best to him, but Lot's gaze was diverted elsewhere. Instead of opting for what God had promised, Lot chose a land that, although it seemed to offer material prosperity, did not have divine blessing. Thus, Lot headed for a land similar to Egypt, a place full of resources but also temptations, where the appearance of well-being often hides an internal corruption. The Promised Land, as we know, is situated between mountains and valleys, watered by rain from heaven, a symbol of divine provision. It does not depend on rivers or earthly sources, but on the grace of God. In contrast, east of Canaan, outside the boundaries of the Promised Land, lies the Jordan Valley, which is watered by the Jordan River, a perennial source, similar to the land of Egypt, which receives its abundance from the Nile River. This difference shows us two types of prosperity, one based on dependence on God and the other on natural forces. In Deuteronomy, it is clearly explained how the Promised Land is different from Egypt. Let us read Deuteronomy 11:10-12 to better understand the distinction between the two places. The land you are entering to possess is not like the land of Egypt from which you came, where you sowed your seed and watered it with your foot, like a garden of vegetables. But the land you are crossing to possess is a land of hills and valleys, drinking water from the rain of heaven. The Lord your God is always watching over it. The eyes of the Lord your God are on it from the beginning of the year to the end. This passage shows us a clear difference between dependence on natural forces and dependence on God. While in Egypt, prosperity depended on human labor to irrigate the land, in the Promised Land, God's blessing was manifested through rain from heaven, a direct provision from above. The Promised Land was not only rich in resources, but it was under the constant gaze and care of God, who protected it from the beginning of the year to the end. It is a reminder that in our spiritual lives, we must always choose to rely on divine provision, just as the people of Israel were to rely on heavenly rain and God's constant vigilance. Lot liked the lifestyle that Egypt offered, where he had constant access to river water no matter what he did. Instead of relying on the rain that God sends as a sign of his blessing to those who live in obedience, Lot opted for what seemed to be an easier and safer life. He could have stayed in the Promised Land, a place where God's blessing was evident, but he chose to go in the opposite direction. He preferred a lifestyle that offered him material abundance and a security that depended on the river, rather than relying entirely on divine provision. He chose material comfort and wealth over spiritual blessings. As we see in the story, Lot began to inch closer to Sodom, a place where wickedness reigned, until he finally settled there, completely forgetting the warning to remain faithful to the Promised Land. This decision cost Lot dearly, since by choosing the material inheritance over the spiritual one, he found himself involved in a series of problems and dangers. First, he was kidnapped during a war between kings, Genesis 14, and although he was rescued by Abraham, that would not be the last time he would face difficulties. Later, the city in which he lived, Sodom, would be destroyed by divine judgment due to the great evil that dwelled there. Lot's life would be marked by tragedy, as his wife would perish when she looked back, disobeying the order not to do so, and his daughters would also stray from the ways of God. In the end, Lot was a clear example of one who, by seeking the riches of this world, loses them all. But we will leave this story, with all its tragic twists, for the end of the video. Despite the beauty and abundance of resources that these cities offered, Sodom and Gomorrah were also known for their great evil. Although they seemed prosperous places, where material life seemed to be comfortable, the true nature of these cities was marked by moral and spiritual corruption. Instead of living according to God's instructions, the inhabitants of Sodom were deeply wicked, and their sin was so great that it reached unbearable levels. In Genesis 18:20, God tells Abraham, "For the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and their sin is so grievous." These words show us how the sin of these cities had reached a point where it could no longer be ignored by God. Faced with this situation, many wonder, what was the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah really about? The answer is found in the Holy Scriptures. The main sin associated with these cities is homosexuality and sexual violence. As humanity moved away from God, it began to pervert the original purpose of sex, a gift that God had given to be enjoyed within the context of a marriage between a man and a woman. This exchange of the natural use of sexuality was filled with vile and shameful passions. The Apostle Paul, writing to the Romans, describes some of the behaviors that human beings began to practice when they turned away from God. In Romans 1:26-27, he says, "For this reason, God gave them over to degrading passions, for even their women exchanged the natural use for that which is unnatural. In the same way, the men also, abandoning the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust for one another, men with men, committing what is shameful, and receiving in themselves the penalty of life for their error." Romans 1:26-27. This passage is one of the clearest explanations of the sin that was occurring in Sodom and Gomorrah. The Bible describes how people, when they turned away from God, were given over to degrading passions. Women changed the natural use of sex, and likewise, men abandoned relations with women and burned with lust for one another, committing shameful acts. The consequence of this deviation was that they received in their bodies the retribution of life for their error, that is, the natural consequences of their sin, which not only affected their relationship with God, but also their bodies and well-being. Similarly, when mentioning the sexual immorality of Sodom and Gomorrah, Jude in his letter said, "Just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which in like manner indulged in sexual immorality and went after unnatural lust, are set for an example, suffering the punishment of eternal fire." Jude 1:7. Another version of this passage from Jude says, "Sodom and Gomorrah, together with the surrounding cities, given over like them to lewdness and homosexuality, suffered the punishment of perpetual fire." This verse highlights the gravity of the sin that was committed in these cities. It is not just about sexual immorality, but about an unbridled desire that went against the natural design that God had established for humanity. This type of behavior was so extreme that, as a result, the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah served as an example to all, showing what happens when a society gives itself over completely to sin and perversion. The punishment they received, eternal fire, is described as a direct consequence of their rebellion. Dear listener, what Jude called unnatural vices are often called alternative ways of life in our modern age. This term may sound innocent in our culture, but it actually denotes sexual behavior that is unnatural and offensive in the eyes of God. When we read Genesis 19:5-8, it becomes clear what both Paul and Jude had in mind. The society of Sodom was deeply immersed in rampant sexual immorality, which included not only homosexual acts, but also aggressive rape. In the Genesis account, the men of the city surround Lot's house, demanding that he hand over the visitors, who were actually angels, to abuse. This scene reflects the extreme perversion and moral corruption that characterized Sodom and Gomorrah. However, apart from homosexuality, other equally serious sins were practiced in Sodom. The Bible not only mentions sexual immorality as the main sin of these cities, but also speaks of arrogance, greed, violence, and lack of hospitality. In Ezekiel 16:49-50 it says, "Behold, this was the iniquity of your sister Sodom. Pride, fullness of bread, and abundance of idleness were in her and in her daughters. And they did not strengthen the hand of the afflicted and needy. They were haughty and committed abomination before me. Therefore I removed them when I saw them." This passage shows how Sodom not only went astray morally, but their sin also included social injustice and indifference to the poor and needy. Number 1. They were lazy because of their abundance of wealth, but they did not help the needy. Rather, they were arrogant and proud. Read Ezekiel 16:49-50. "Behold, this was the iniquity of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, full of bread and full of idleness. They did not strengthen the hand of the poor and needy. They were haughty and committed abomination before me. Therefore I removed them when I saw them." This passage reveals one of the most tragic aspects of Sodom. their lack of compassion and help toward those in need, despite the abundance they had. Their wealth and comfort made them indifferent to the suffering of others, which reflects one of the great reasons why they were destroyed. Behold, this was the iniquity of your sister Sodom. Pride, fullness of bread, and abundance of idleness were in her and in her daughters, and they did not strengthen the hand of the afflicted and needy. They became arrogant and committed abominations before me, and when I saw it, I removed them. Ezekiel 16:49-50. This passage from Ezekiel highlights one of the key reasons for the destruction of Sodom: its self-centeredness and indifference to the suffering of others. The arrogance and excessive comfort enjoyed by the inhabitants of these cities made them blind to the needs of others. The abundance of bread and free time, far from encouraging generosity, led them to arrogance, which became the root of their downfall. Not only did they ignore the afflicted and needy, but they gave themselves over to vanity, committing abominations in the eyes of God. This is a reminder that material blessings are not an excuse for negligence or lack of compassion toward others. Number 2, they ate adultery, lived in lies, and defended the wrongdoer. In Jeremiah 23:14 it is said, "And I have seen in the prophets of Jerusalem foolishness. They committed adultery and walked in lies, and they strengthened the hands of the wicked, so that none was converted of their wickedness. They were all like Sodom to me, and their inhabitants like Gomorrah." This verse shows us one of the darkest characteristics of the corruption in Sodom and Gomorrah. Not only did they live in sin, but they also encouraged wickedness in others. The leaders and prophets of Jerusalem, who were supposed to guide the people to righteousness, committed adultery and lied, and instead of correcting the wrongdoers, they supported them, strengthening their hands in their wickedness. Sodom, in its decline, became a place where evil was accepted and even promoted, which was one of the reasons why God decided to destroy it. Number 3, they made their sin public without being ashamed of it. Let's read Isaiah 3:8-9. "For Jerusalem is ruined, and Judah is fallen, for their tongue and their deeds have been against the Lord, to provoke the eyes of his majesty. The appearance of their faces testifies against them, because like Sodom they publish their sin, they do not conceal it. Woe to their souls, for they have heaped evil upon themselves." This verse shows one of the most serious characteristics of Sodom's sin. Not only did they live in sin, but they did so openly and unashamedly. They publicized their wickedness without attempting to hide it, as if they had no awareness of their offense toward God. Similarly, the society of Sodom reached a point where they were no longer ashamed of their behavior but proclaimed it to the world. This is a clear reminder of how sin can become so normalized that people display it publicly without any sense of guilt or repentance. Dear listener, the residents of Sodom had become so wicked that when Abraham interceded with God for that city, not even 10 righteous people could be found among them. In Genesis 18:32, Abraham asks God, "Do not be angry, Lord, if I speak just one more time. What if 10 righteous people are found there?" God answers him that he would not destroy the city for the sake of those 10 righteous men. However, not even 10 righteous people could be found in the entire city. This lack of justice and righteousness shows the extreme level of corruption that had invaded Sodom. The city was no longer only known for its sin, but it had also become a place where goodness and righteousness had almost completely disappeared. As we can read in verses 28-32 of chapter 18 of Genesis, Abraham lowered the number of righteous men from 50 successively to 45, 40, 30, 20, and finally 10. And here the question arises, why did Abraham not continue asking below 10? It is possible that he did not dare. Perhaps he was assailed by the doubt that Lot was really lost, and this worried him so much that he decided not to continue asking. Surely, if he had persisted to the point of asking if God would have destroyed the city if there were only one righteous man in it, God would have answered him. If There is one righteous man in the city. I will take him out of the city, for I will not destroy a righteous man with that city." The reason Abraham stopped interceding could be the fear that in his heart he already knew that the wickedness of the city was so great that not even a righteous man could be there without being affected. How do we know that God would have responded in this way? Because that is indeed what happened. In the face of Abraham's doubts, it turns out that there was one righteous man in the city, and God knew him. It was Lot. The Apostle Peter, in his second letter, wrote that Lot vexed his righteous soul day by day, seeing and hearing their unrighteous deeds. 2 Peter 2:8. Despite the corruption of Sodom, Lot was a righteous man who, although he lived in the midst of a completely corrupt society, maintained his integrity and his faith in God. For this reason, 2 angels were sent to Sodom with the purpose of saving Lot, because despite its surroundings, God did not forget the righteous man who lived there. This shows us that, although evil spreads throughout the land, an entire city, the Lord always knows who his faithful ones are and will protect them. In Genesis 19 it says, "Now the 2 angels came to Sodom at evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed himself with his face to the ground and said, 'Now, my lords, please come into your servant's house and stay there, and I will wash your feet, and in the morning you may get up and go on your way.' They said, 'No, we will stay out in the street tonight.' But he urged them very much, and they went with him and entered his house. Lot made them a feast, baked unleavened bread, and they ate." This passage reflects the hospitality and godly heart of Lot, who, despite being surrounded by the sin and corruption of his city, still maintained the courage to show kindness and obey God's principles. Lot, like Abraham, was a man of faith who, even in his difficult situation, did everything possible to follow what he considered right. My dear friends, we see that when the angels came to Sodom, Lot was sitting at the gate of the city. Those who did so were serving as public judges. This makes it clear to us that Lot not only resided in that community, but that by entering the judicial career, he had also become integrated into public and political life. We are also struck by Lot's hospitable attitude in offering lodging in his house to travelers. It was normal for him to need to wash his feet, having traveled that dusty road from the plains of Mamre to Sodom, wearing sandals typical of the time. In addition to the relief that this gesture implied, it was a way of expressing and offering hospitality to visitors. This act of kindness stands out even more, considering the context in which he lived, surrounded by corruption and perversion, and shows how Lot maintained his integrity despite the immorality that surrounded him. At first, the travelers, so as not to cause inconvenience, were reluctant to accept the invitation and suggested spending the night in the streets or in the square. But Lot, aware of the danger they would be in because of the atmosphere in the city, insistently begged them to stay at his house. We, who know the circumstances of our large cities, especially at night with increasing crime and violence, are increasingly sensitive to the insecurity of citizens. In many places around the world, the risk of walking the streets late at night is palpable, and concern for safety becomes a priority for those who venture out of the house. Similarly, Lot knew that the city of Sodom was not safe, and he did not want visitors to suffer the consequences of the rampant wickedness that prevailed there. Therefore, he did everything possible to protect them, knowing that the city was about to face divine judgment. Let us continue with the biblical account, but before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, all the people together, both young and old, surrounded the house and called to Lot and said to him, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out so we can see them." So Lot went out to them at the door and shut the door behind him. "My brothers, please do not do such a wicked thing. Now behold, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. I will bring them out to you, and you may do with them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under my roof." In this passage, we see an act of extreme perversion. The men of Sodom, without any shame, present themselves as a mob surrounding Lot's house, demanding that he hand over the visitors to them so they can sexually abuse them. The word "no" in this context refers to a sexual act, which is part of the gravity of the situation. Lot, in a desperate attempt to protect the angels who were under his roof, offer his daughters in a tragic gesture, which, although incomprehensible to us today, reflected Lot's desperation in the face of imminent danger. But they answered, "Get away from here." And they added, "This stranger came to live among us, and he will set himself up as a judge. Now we will do you more harm than them." And they did great violence to the man Lot, and came near to break down the door. This moment reflects the complete moral degeneration of the society of Sodom. The crowd not only rejects Lot's offer, but also threatens him violently, expressing their indignation at the fact that a foreigner has settled among them and dares to exercise judgment. The hostility towards Lot becomes increasingly aggressive, to the point of trying to break down the door of his house to take what they wanted by force. This reaction reveals a deep perversion and rejection of justice and order, where values are inverted and what is good is attacked. The people of Sodom demonstrated profound wickedness in attempting to abuse the two visitors, acting in an abominable and unconscionable manner. This is not just an act of lust, but a clear sign of the moral corruption that characterized that city. Lot, seeing the violence that was coming, pleaded with them, "I beg you, brothers, do not do such wickedness." It was a painful dilemma for Lot, who knew that the values he held were completely different from those of the men of Sodom. While they were only seeking to satisfy their desires, Lot tried, in vain, to make them see the wickedness of their actions. It is difficult not to be astonished to see that Lot, in a desperate attempt to protect his visitors, was willing to offer his daughters to the crowd. This proposal is difficult to justify and is shocking to any reader. The men of Sodom displayed extreme depravity, but no less shocking is Lot's willingness to sacrifice his daughters in such a humiliating act. To better understand this terrible situation, it is crucial to consider the social dynamics of the time. In the pre-Christian world, women were held in a much lower position, while guests enjoyed a much higher level of respect and protection. In that context, guests were expected to be protected at all costs, even above one's own family. It is important to highlight the words of the aggressors. "This stranger has come to live among us, and he will set himself up as a judge." Here we see that the men of Sodom did not just mock Lot for his apparent political influence in the city, but they attacked his authority and openly defied him. Their contempt for Lot and his family was such that they would have destroyed them all had it not been for divine intervention. The angels, with their supernatural power, blinded the uncontrollable mob, and in this way, the threat against Lot and his family was stopped. This physical blindness of the attackers is also a symbol of their spiritual blindness. Although their eyes were physically blinded, their hearts were already completely hardened and blind to the truth and justice of God. Let us continue. With the biblical account, the angels said to Lot, "Do you have anyone else here? Your sons, your daughters, everything you have in the city, take them out of this place, because we are going to destroy this city, since the outcry against it has increased before Jehovah." Lot, upon hearing this terrible news, quickly left and went to speak to his future sons-in-law, the men who had become engaged to his daughters. He warned them, "Get up, get out of this place, because Jehovah is going to destroy this city." However, to his sons-in-law, Lot seemed to be joking because they did not take his warning seriously. This moment shows how difficult it had been for Lot to remain firm in his faith. After having lived so many years in Sodom, where wickedness and corruption were the order of the day, Lot was forced to leave the city. As a matter of fact, Lot had come to tolerate that environment. Even his daughters, who had been raised in that context, were engaged to young men who shared those same values. For that reason, when Lot tried to warn his future sons-in-law and told them to flee with him, they mocked him. Lot had lived so long in Sodom, adapting to their lifestyle, that he no longer seemed different from them. Therefore, his grave warning was taken lightly as a joke. This situation shows how Lot, by choosing to live in that city, had departed from God's will for his life. Furthermore, it is evident that he had not been a firm witness of his faith, nor had he stood up for his own Christian values. This is a reality that many Christians face today. Many adapt so much to the values of the world that they end up compromising their Christian beliefs. Instead of bringing others closer to Christ, their life reflects the opposite, leading others away from the true gospel. It is a reminder of how important it is to maintain a firm identity in God without giving in to the pressures of the culture around us. And when dawn came, the angels urged Lot to get up, saying, "Get up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, so that you will not perish in the punishment of the city." Lot, still hesitating, did not act as quickly as expected in such a serious situation. It was then that the angels, acting with God's mercy, took Lot by the hand and his wife and daughters to get them out of the city and out of danger. This divine intervention highlights something important. Despite Lot's lack of decision, God acted with grace and mercy to save him. The salvation of Lot and his family did not depend on their perfection, but on the goodness and mercy of God. This is a reminder that even though we are imperfect and sometimes indecisive, God's grace is ready to help us if we hold on to Him. We can say that despite everything, Lot truly belonged to God. If we only had the account in the book of Genesis, we might doubt his standing before God. However, since the Apostle Peter called him righteous in his second letter, we can be sure that Lot was saved. Lot had become considered righteous by God thanks to his faith, because, like Abraham, he chose to follow God and share with him his worship and sacrifices. So, in his great mercy, God saved Lot and his family. Even though he believed God's word, we cannot ignore that his personal and family situation was full of difficulties. Lot, caught up in the stresses of living in a city full of sin, hesitated, delayed, and wavered so much that angels had to force him out of the city. And even outside the city, when the angels commanded him to flee and not look back, Lot could not help but hesitate. He felt that escaping to the mountain was a difficult task, and instead he asked to take refuge in a small town nearby, Zoar. This shows how, despite God's intervention, Lot still had internal struggles and personal fears that made him hesitate. It seems almost unthinkable that a small town, so close to Sodom and Gomorrah, could have escaped the corrupting influence of those large cities. The moral depravity of Sodom and Gomorrah was so deep that it is hard to imagine that a nearby place would not share their same decadence. Therefore, Lot's request to take refuge in Zoar was not the ideal solution. However, despite not being the best option, God granted his request, allowing him to go to that small town. This divine permission shows God's patience and mercy, but it also reveals an important truth: Lot's lack of full obedience to the instructions given. Although he escaped the destruction of Sodom, his request to stay in Zoar shows that his spiritual integrity was compromised. Lot had not fully completed the flight to the refuge that God had indicated to him, which indicated that he still had much to learn. This attitude of not completely following God's ways would cause him to face more problems in the future. When Lot arrived at Zoar, with the sun beginning to rise, what had been prophesied began to be fulfilled: God's judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah. As had been said, Jehovah rained sulfur and fire from the heavens completely, destroying those cities and the surrounding plain with all their inhabitants and everything that existed there. This destruction was not only a physical catastrophe, but also a clear sign of divine judgment, which was total and without mercy for the cities of great wickedness. However, just at the moment when judgment was beginning to be carried out, something strange happened. Lot's wife, despite the warnings, looked back, and in that instant she turned into a pillar of salt. This act of disobedience was a symbol of her attachment to the world and her lack of faith in God's promise. According to the angel, judgment would not come until Lot and his family were safely in Zoar, thus ensuring that God's promise to Abraham was fulfilled. As soon as Lot and his family were brought to safety, judgment was consummated. Fire and brimstone fell from heaven, and the cities were destroyed. Despite God's mercy toward Lot, judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah was clear and final once God verified the wickedness of those cities and provided a righteous testimony through Lot's life. Today, many people believe that the ancient cities of Sodom and Gomorrah lie beneath the Dead Sea, which would be a testimony to God's total destruction and judgment. However, beyond the geographical evidence, the destruction of these cities remains a shocking reminder of divine justice, which not only punishes evil, but also saves the righteous. Before its destruction, the area around Sodom was so beautiful and productive that it was described as the Garden of Jehovah, a fertile and lush region similar to the paradise gardens of old. However, despite this natural privilege, the beauty of the region failed to transform the hearts of its inhabitants. On the contrary, their prosperity led them to perdition. This contrast between beauty and corruption is reminiscent of the city of Yungay in Peru, which, before the devastating earthquake of 1970, was also a prosperous and beautiful city, but was devastated by a natural tragedy that showed the fragility of what seemed invulnerable. The people of Sodom and Gomorrah had witnessed the greatness of divine grace and mercy, far more than any other region at that time. They were preserved from destruction thanks to the intercession of Abraham, who had been chosen by God to intercede for them. Furthermore, they had the testimony of Melchizedek, the priest-king who represented the connection between God and men, and they saw Abraham's example of faith and obedience. They were blessed with great opportunities and with clear signs of God's care and protection. However, despite all these displays of divine love, they decided to reject everything that God had offered them. We also see that Lot's wife looked back from behind him and turned into a pillar of salt. Why did she do this? The answer seems to be twofold. First, I think she did not want to leave Sodom because she loved it. Sure, she loved Lot too, but there were things in that city to which she felt deeply attached, material things, memories, and a life she had known for so long. Her body left the city, but her heart remained there, trapped in the life she had known. This attitude is a lesson for us. It is possible to have a divided heart where even though we profess a relationship with God, there are factors or attachments that separate us from a true relationship, communion with Him. There are Christians who find themselves in this constant struggle, wanting to follow God, but at the same time trapped in the world that they cannot completely leave behind. As a result, they fail to live a full life or achieve the purpose that God has for them. These factors, which can be friendships, habits, or attachment to certain material things, nullify our faith and our Christian testimony. The Bible teaches us that without faith, without that, a constant communion with God, and without obeying His word, our spiritual life goes out. A divided heart cannot experience the fullness of Christian life. It is like a fire that slowly goes out. Disobedience is the inevitable result of a faith weakened by the compromises and attachments of the world. Just as Lot's wife could not resist the temptation to look back, many of us, when we have not fully given our hearts to God, continue to look to the past, to what we left behind, and that prevents us from moving forward in the divine purpose that He has for us. Second, another reason why Lot's wife looked back was that she did not believe in God and did not take seriously the instructions God had given. They were not to stop or look back. Lot believed in God and obeyed, but his wife did not. She stayed there, perishing with all those things she could not let go of. Her attachment to material things and to life in Sodom led her to not understand the gravity of the situation. God's warning was clear: run away without looking back, but she could not let go of her past. This act of disobedience reflects a profound truth. Many times, sin lies in not fully believing what God tells us. Lack of faith in God's promises can cause us to cling to things that destroy us, without realizing the salvation that is offered to us. And Abraham went up in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord, and looked toward Sodom and Gomorrah, and toward all the land of that plain. And he looked, and behold, smoke rose from the earth like the smoke of a furnace. The image presented to us in this verse is powerful and dramatic. Abraham, from his high point, observes God's judgment on the cities that had reached the height of wickedness. The smoke rising from the earth is a clear sign of the total destruction of what was once a prosperous city. For Abraham, this vision must have been painful, because he had interceded for the city, but he did not find enough righteous people to save it. This moment reminds us of the severity of God's judgment on sin, but also of His perfect justice. Sometimes we do not fully understand why certain things happen, but we must trust that God acts according to His wisdom and justice, even if His decisions hurt us. Abraham, seeing the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, was able to confirm what God had revealed to him. This vision was to be a reminder to him of the importance of making decisions based on faith and commitment to God's plans. Although he may have had doubts, his faith allowed him to recognize that God's justice would prevail, even when the judgment was severe. Unlike Lot's wife, who felt bound to the past, Abraham did not mourn over what was lost, but rather trusted fully in God's wisdom and justice. In this sense, his life was a reflection of a faithfulness that did not attach itself to the world or its temptations, but remained firm in the principles of obedience to God. He had chosen to live according to the divine will, not like the inhabitants of those cities who through their sin had rejected all the good that God had given them. Surely, as Abraham watched the devastation of Sodom and Gomorrah, he also remembered God's promise to protect the righteous, as he had done with his nephew Lot. God had assured him that he would save the righteous from punishment, and Lot had been delivered, thanks to that divine mercy. However, Abraham could not help but see the gravity of the situation. The cities of the plain had reached a level of corruption such that divine justice had to be fulfilled. This event would serve as a reminder of the fleeting and destructive nature of the world in which they lived, a world in which evil and selfishness are given priority over justice and compassion. This thought reminds us of the words of the Apostle John in his first letter, chapter 2, verse 15. Do not love the world, nor the things that are in the world. The love of the world and its pleasures can lead us to stray from the will of God, and although Abraham had been faithful, the tragedies of Sodom and Gomorrah became a warning for the righteous not to be seduced by the temptations of the world, and to remain firm in their obedience to God. Verses 30-38 of Genesis 19 show us how, despite being spared from the destruction of Sodom, Lot still found no peace. Fear drove him to flee Zoar, since, although it was a small town, it was probably not safe enough or different from Sodom, where perversion was still in the air. Lot took refuge in the mountains with his daughters, which underlines the desperation and distrust he felt towards places close to corruption. The most tragic thing about this passage is that, in their isolation and desperation, Lot's daughters made a deeply wrong decision. Employing a regrettable act of manipulation and abuse, they got their father drunk and then slept with him. The result of this incest was the Moabites and the Ammonites, two peoples who, throughout history, would become persistent enemies of Israel. This tragic episode teaches us how wrong decisions, fear, and distancing from the divine will can lead to generational consequences. The Moabites and the Ammonites would be, from then on, a constant threat to Abraham's descendants, reflecting the rupture and pain that is generated when one abandons God's path. Lot's decisions were the cause of his ruin. He lost everything he had, his material goods, his wife, and ended up unconsciously participating in an act of sexual indecency with his daughters, giving birth to two sons who, in the future, would become enemies of Israel. Many people fail to see what sin can produce in their lives, but the truth is that anyone who practices sin will end up badly sooner or later. The best thing is to flee from this sinful world. Dear friend, let us not wait to lose everything we have and see ourselves ruined by sin. Let us escape in time from its terrible consequences and eternal damnation. If this message has touched you, do not forget to like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more content that will help you grow in your faith. If you have any questions or reflections, leave them in the comments. I would love to read them. May God bless you.